Okay, ladies and gentlemen, can we start this event? My name is Donatas Kupčiūnas. I'm a Baltic Fellow at the Center for Geopolitics, as well as a Research Fellow at Wolfson College, Cambridge here. And it is my greatest pleasure to welcome you to this event. And today, we'll be talking about Oliver Moody's brand new book, which is called Baltic, the Future of Europe. You can buy this in all fine bookstores everywhere. I bought this on Amazon. It's a great little book, or not that little actually. And it does what it says on the cover, essentially. It's a book about the place of Baltic security in a sort of wider picture of European and perhaps even global geopolitics. So a few words about the author himself. Now, Oliver Moody received his degree in classics and Arabic at the University of the other place, which is also called Oxford here. He joined the Times as a graduate trainee in 2011, spending some years as a leader, writer, and then as a newspaper science correspondent. Since 2018, Oliver has been the Berlin bureau chief for the Times of London, covering Germany and Northern and Central Europe. And he also presents the New Germany podcast for the Körbe Stiftung. Oliver did a massive amount of research for this book. He talked to a whole bunch of specimens in the region itself. He tried to understand how they think and operate in the wild, these people. And we, the Balts, are usually very intrigued when some foreigner tries to write something about our little region. So Oliver, we're very much looking forward to hearing your findings. So I'll leave you here for about 40 minutes and then I'll join you for a Q&A session. Please welcome Oliver Moody.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction and for the invitation. I've admired the Center for Geopolitics from afar for some years now, and I've been watching some of the events on YouTube, but this is the first time I've been here. And I think it's particularly great that it's not only a centre for Baltic scholarship, which is all too rare in Western Europe, but also does it in a kind of joined up way with other strands of geopolitics rather than in isolation. So I am profoundly glad that this place exists. By way of warning, before I get started, I should tell you that a couple of days ago, my assistant and I were tidying up the Times Berlin bureau and got lost in the archive of newspaper cuttings. And I found this entry from November the 6th, 1989, where one of my predecessors said, although the Berlin Wall no longer serves the purpose for which it was built, it would be wrong to think that it will come down soon. It came down 3 days later. So I think any Times journalist prognoses about even the very near future should be taken with a generous pinch of salt. Donatas was very generous about the title. I thought initially it was fairly preposterous. I hope to convince you by the end of this event that it does actually mean something that's not quite as ludicrous as it might seem. And I'll talk about three things. First of all, why I think we should treat the Baltic Sea region as a region. Secondly, why I think it matters so much. And third, going beyond the scope of the book, really, where we are at now, where we've come to in the 6 months since I handed it into the publisher, and where we might be going in terms of Europe, Donald Trump, and NATO. So the Baltic Sea region as a region seems really self-evident to me, but it's something I've had a hard time convincing people of in Britain and Germany. They often tend to think this is just about the Baltic states, or that it's just about hybrid warfare. Some of them think it's about the Balkans, a conversation I had last night headed in that direction. It's about the stories of the 9 countries that directly abut the Baltic Sea. That is, going around clockwise from the west, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Germany. And if you set Russia aside, it's not only a region, it is the most networked region on the planet by a lot of metrics. And I think it is the single greatest success story of European integration in my lifetime, this wiring together of what used to be the Western and Eastern halves of Europe. And this month, the European Union's white paper on defence, one of the most significant geopolitical steps that the Commission has taken in a long time, was presented to the public by an Estonian High Representative, a Lithuanian Defence Commissioner, with a great deal of input from a Latvian Economics Commissioner, a Polish Budget Commissioner, a Finnish Vice President of the Commission for Technological Sovereignty and Security, and all in tandem and under the aegis of a German President of the European Commission. And we can come back to what that actually says about where the power lies in Europe, but just to dwell on the symbolism for a moment, this would have been completely unimaginable when I was a child in the 1990s, and I think it's a token of how far things have come. So if we start with a very quick potted history of the region over the last century, I'll begin with some bonus material that didn't quite make it into the book. I got very interested in how my British predecessors had seen the Baltic states after they first won their independence from Russia after the First World War, and in particularly in the early 1920s. And they tended to be admiring, yes, supportive, yes, patronising, yes, but also very sceptical of their chances of survival, believing that they were essentially doomed, a kind of accident of geopolitics that had bubbled up between Germany and Russia and couldn't last for long. So I'll read you through a few samples. This first one is from Arthur Ransom, the Manchester Gardens Moscow correspondent, alleged double agent for the Bolsheviks, better known to most people in this room probably as the author of Swallows and Amazons and various other classic British novels. He really liked the Estonians. He knew them pretty well. By his own account, he had been sort of a middleman in brokering their peace treaty with the Soviet Union in 1920. And on one visit, he said, nobody in Reval, that is what Tallinn used to be called, tries to dress well, with the exception of a few young women, and they, by the manner of their failure, do but emphasise this cardinal virtue of their native place. Top hats were unknown there until the British consul and vice-consul spread awe and astonishment by wearing them on state occasions, thereby startling the ministers into ordering at least 2 of them from England for the use of the cabinet. Ransom does have the decency to add, not for a moment would I be thought to laugh at men who had the courage to carry through a foreign policy against the almost open threats of greater powers, and have had the satisfaction of seeing half Europe follow at their heels. Then we come to John Buchan, very energetic colonial administrator who again will probably be better known to a lot of people here for his novels, in particular The 39 Steps and the other Richard Hannay books. I'm not sure he ever actually set foot in the Baltic republics, but he did publish a voluminous book about them in 1924. And these judgments, I mean, let them sort of stand in as a kind of placeholder for a lot of the tone of a lot of the other judgments made by British writers at the time. Here he is talking about the Estonians and the Latvians. The 2 races, inheritors of a prehistoric feud, resemble each other only in their sufferings. The Estonians are believed to be Mongols. The Lets are an Indo-Germanic race. The broad visage of the Estonian has slanting eyes, low forehead, high cheekbones and a projecting lower jaw, and his speech, like his appearance, is not of Europe. It goes on and on and on. But then he comes on to the history and he says, it cannot be doubtful that small, isolated and backward races like the Lets and Estonians, occupying a region both attractive and adjacent to several stronger peoples, were doomed to servitude, if not extinction, which is really characteristic of the lens through which Western Europeans look not just at the history of the Baltic republics, but at their present at that point. At the same time, in the Baltic republics themselves, there were writers and politicians, most notably Jan Tõnisson in Estonia, who were pushing the idea of a kind of grand federation or alliance that would take in not just the three Baltic republics, but also in various configurations, possibly Pilsudski's Poland, also newly independent Finland to the north, possibly the Swedes and the Danes. And as we know, those alliances never came to fruition. The optimists were wrong, the skeptics were right. The end of the 1930s, you had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the German-Soviet invasion of Poland, the Soviet invasion of Finland that led to the Winter War, the Soviet annexations of the three Baltic states, followed by half a century of Soviet occupation with a brief interlude of Nazi German occupation. And if we go to the end of that era of occupation, when Sąjūdis in Lithuania and the popular fronts in Estonia and Latvia were really starting to press the case for more autonomy and ultimately independence from the Soviet Union. You go back to the diplomatic archives from this amazing moment in 1990 when the Lithuanians reasserted their independence, leading to an economic blockade from Gorbachev. And you can read the deliberations of the Western powers, and they were horrified by this moment because they had put all of their bets on Gorbachev. The West Germans in particular were terrified that this would undermine the cause of German reunification shortly after the wall had come down. They put a lot of pressure, both the Germans and the French, put a lot of pressure on the Lithuanians to back down. And they were generally agreed that the best possible thing Lithuania could hope for was a status like Finland had had during the Cold War, that is, with its foreign and defence policy entirely subordinate to what Moscow wanted. And there was a moment where François Mitterrand, the French president of the day, said to Helmut Kohl, the West German chancellor, "We cannot endanger everything we have achieved just to help countries that have not had an existence of their own in 400 years." Ultimately, Lithuania was first recognised not by America or Britain or West Germany or France, but by Iceland, and then Denmark, and Estonia and Latvia had their independence recognised very shortly after that. So at the end of the Cold War, and the Baltic is a complete mess. It resembles the Sea of Confusion that the Russian Tsar Peter I called it. You have Denmark in the European community and NATO, you have Sweden in neither, sticking to its long-established policy of non-alignment. You have Finland coming out of this Finlandization era, pursuing a policy of balance, still very wary of Russia. You have Russia in total turmoil, but already by 92, 93, reactionary forces are starting to win the upper hand in its politics and administration. You have a freshly reunified Germany, and you have the Baltic states absolutely desperate to anchor themselves in the West and trying to join every single Western club that would have them. And from that standpoint, it is just amazing to me how it has all come together over the past 35 years, and how that process has been supercharged and securitized over the past 10 years by Vladimir Putin's attacks on Ukraine, starting in 2014 and then, of course, in 2022. And I'm not a fan of the kind of Lake NATO meme online. I think it fosters a certain degree of unhealthy complacency. But this is the most coherent that Northeastern Europe has ever been. You have the Nordic and Baltic states working together with what to me seems more closeness on a more equal footing than ever before. You have Poland starting to kind of look north, having previously been a very kind of land-centric power. You have Germany getting more involved. This is Jan Tönisson's dream on steroids. Why am I dwelling on this? Well, if this moment is, as Thomas Ilves, the former Estonian president, said in an event I attended this morning, the point where the Pax Americana ends, it is a shock to us in Europe of a magnitude that is at the very least comparable with the shock of 1989 and the years that followed, but not in a good way. And we are going to have to rebuild a lot of things from the ground up, and we're going to have to do it very quickly, and we're going to have to revise some of our most fundamental assumptions about how the world works and what our place in it is. And I think what happened in the Baltic region is not a one-to-one template for what we're going to do now, but for me it is a study in the agency of small states, the power of contingency, the possibilities that open up to you when you are adaptable, and above all, what you can achieve with an existential sense of urgency. So moving on to the second part, why does the Baltic region matter? Well, in a very obvious sense, and we're very used to talking about this in Britain, it matters strategically because it is the most vulnerable part of NATO, give or take maybe some bits of Norway. And in the book, I talk a lot about how we can assess the intentions of the Putin regime. Spoiler, it's very difficult. And its capabilities, which is something where you can make a lot more progress and say much more sensible things. I talk about how we can do deterrence, which fundamentally means being prepared to fight and win a conventional war. And under NATO's new doctrine, that means doing so right from the border and trying to hold the border for as long as you can, winning every battle, as the NATO generals put it. And I'll come back to this a bit later and we can pick it up in the questions. But the main thing I'd like to say here is that I think we should move on from looking at the Baltic region exclusively as a point of European vulnerability and start thinking of it as a model that we can learn things from. And the most basic way that it's a model, in my view, was expressed very nicely by Artis Pabriks, who was the Latvian foreign minister a decade ago, addressing the Council of the Baltic Sea states, when he described it as always a developing region. It's a part of the world where the end of history never happened, and where particularly, but not only, the Baltic states have a sense of futurity and not just a kind of defensiveness about trying to preserve what we've already established. And the sense of time is particularly interesting in the politics of these countries. You can look at Finland. I did a whole chapter on this in the book, and its approach to grand strategy measured over decades, an extremely kind of careful calibration in a way that allows you to react very flexibly when world events shift. But also in Estonia, Lennart Meri, the kind of figurehead of the restored republic in the 1990s, had this amazing sense that time was constantly running through his fingers. And he kind of imparted this sense of absolute hurry to his whole government and to the entire project of securing Estonia's independence. And once you have those two ways of looking at time, you do open up a lot of other possibilities. And one of which is this whole cluster of things that we're now starting to recognise the Baltic Sea countries, and especially the frontline countries that share a border with Russia, are amazing at. And we have different terms for it: total defence, comprehensive security, whole of society, resilience, also the recognition of hard power and the need to maintain a credible military of your own. And again, there's a lot of detail in the book. I'm not going to bore you with it now. I'll just say it was extraordinary to me a few weeks ago at a defence conference in Berlin to see Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, the chief of the British Armed Forces, on a panel with his counterparts from Estonia, Lithuania, Finland and Sweden, openly admitting that Britain's culture of civil defence and comprehensive security is a long way behind theirs, and that the British Armed Forces and the Defence Ministry are studying these countries to see what they can learn from them and translate into British policy. And I think this isn't going to work unless we understand that what you see in these countries is almost a different kind of social contract that is founded on the idea that the primary duty of the state towards its citizens is to secure them. And the hardest thing, I think, is going to be carrying that sense of directness through to Western Europe and beyond, maybe to North America, places like Canada, and saying it's not about proximity to Russia, because if there is a war, and you speak to anybody involved at the high levels of the British defence establishment about this, the reality is that Britain will also be hit. And there are generals and retired generals who will deplore the failure to invest in domestic air and missile defence and how open that has left us. The next thing I think we can really benefit from in studying the Baltic Sea region is what foreign policy wonks call multilateralism. That is the art of building small coalitions of countries that are flexible but at the same time kind of coherent enough to get things done. They are agile. And a good kind of case study in how this hasn't worked but really could is the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a British-led sub-NATO alliance that includes the Baltic and Nordic states and the Netherlands. Was set up after the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, and I think has tremendous potential to be the nucleus of our response to the US strategically detaching itself from us or even turning actively hostile. And finally, that sense of urgency opens up a kind of creativity and agility because you have to move fast. And the particularly shining example of that, which is the first chapter of the book, is the story of Estonia and above all its tech sector, which is good because it had to be, because there were very few natural resources and they had to work with what they had, which was human capital. So in terms of where we are now, I basically finished writing this book last summer and put the finishing touches on in October, which is a few weeks before the US presidential election on November the 5th and the subsequent collapse of Germany's coalition government. And it was an interesting mental exercise having that uncertainty looming over writing the book, because it forces you to look at the underlying dynamics in the transatlantic relationship. And it was patently obvious that whoever was in the White House, the US is in a process of reprioritization, that it would be pressuring Europe in gentle or tougher terms to take on more of the burden of its own security. And since Trump won the election and came back into the White House, I've heard a lot of voices from the Baltic region saying, "I told you so. You didn't listen to us when you had the chance. You should have anticipated this and done all of the things that we said." And I think it's not just unattractive, but I think it's a mistaken and a misdiagnosis of where we are. The speech by the American Vice President J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference this February, God, it was only 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, was a watershed like nothing else I've experienced in my 14 years as a journalist. And on the European side, especially in Germany where I'm based, it's really not just hurt feelings, although there's plenty of that. It's a sense that there is actually a strategy here which Trump may not have come up with or even necessarily be aware of, but which he has endorsed and which is being pursued very energetically by Vance, of political interference in our own domestic politics and trying to remould Europe in the image of the MAGA movement. And while it might be Germany that is in the crosshairs of that today, or Romania, it could be anyone in Europe tomorrow. And certainly in Poland, there's almost a sense of paralysis that stems from the concern that there is currently a right-wing populist candidate in the presidential election coming up very hard in the polls. And there is polling showing that a single endorsement from Elon Musk could influence the votes of 40% of the electorate. The danger for us now, I think, is not Donald Trump pulling us out of NATO, and it's not even necessarily the formal end of US extended nuclear deterrence, this idea that we are all under their atomic umbrella by virtue of NATO's Article 5 Mutual Defence Clause. It's a scenario in which Trump is so desperate to achieve peace in Ukraine that he does so not under terms that are very disadvantageous to Ukraine and therefore to Europe's security, but that he also agrees to the one thing that Putin has made it really clear he wanted since the months preceding his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and that is for NATO to retreat behind the borders that it last had in 1997. And I think it is a real concern, and this is certainly something that is also exercising the minds of many European diplomats right now, that obviously Trump cannot force the rest of NATO to do that, but he can pull back the American troops. There are 20,000 American troops stationed in Poland and rotating through the Baltic states, who were surged into the area by Joe Biden after the invasion in 2022, who are absolutely the pillar of conventional deterrence in the region. And then that opens up this kind of spheres of influence logic that Trump seems to find very appealing. And you can play with scenarios where he would not just neglect the defence of Europe in a crisis, but might even actively hinder it. And this is certainly something that's been preying on people's minds since we saw the US stop supplying spare parts, intelligence and targeting software to the Ukrainians for their various bits of high technology weaponry. How do we handle this? It's a very obvious answer, which is we spend a lot more money on our defence base, and we do everything that we can to encourage our domestic armaments industries. And Poland's already at 5%. Denmark has said it's going over 3%. Sweden's just announced a very large increase. All three of the Baltic states now plan to go above 5% of their GDP. Germany, the incoming government, has absolutely opened the floodgates on an epical scale with a reform of the constitution that effectively, well, theoretically means unlimited defence spending, although in practice it's more likely to end up being 3.5% of GDP. But what do you do then? You need to Europeanise NATO, or found some kind of analogue to NATO that can survive without the Americans, or even despite the Americans if things get really bad. How do you deal with the fact that 80% of the military intelligence currently going through NATO's headquarters is American? How do you deal with the fact that Americans supply so many of the senior officers in NATO that it's not clear whether we have enough officers of that rank and competence that we can spare collectively as Europe to replace them? How do we do nuclear deterrence with just Trident and the French force de frappe? But most fundamentally, what political structures have we got to fall back on if the North Atlantic Council, the political decision-making body of NATO, the people who will sit in the room and decide whether to invoke Article 5 in a crisis, can't reach unanimity, whether it's too slow to recognise the situation or whether certain members are willfully blind to the situation, you're going to need to construct some kind of workaround. And where are those ideas going to come from? Quite possibly Britain, although if you look at the painstaking process of getting the strategic review out, it's not clear that there is currently that much agility at the top levels of our government. In Germany, the sources that I've spoken to in their incoming government make it very clear they see their job as to be the money man and to provide the organisational and institutional muscle to make things work, but they certainly don't see their role as coming up with new initiatives. It's possible that President Macron in France could take the initiative on this sort of thing, but then again, he's going to be heading into what could potentially be a very time-consuming and energy-consuming election in a year's time for the election in 2027. Poland, again, caught in the headlights. I think this initiative, if it comes from anywhere, could come from northeastern Europe. And I can totally understand how and why these countries have chosen to play the transatlantic crisis so far, which is basically to publicly keep calm and carry on, to keep buying large quantities of American military hardware. And we've seen this work with varying degrees of success. Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, was in Warsaw on his first foreign trip in office and praised Poland as a model ally. You then had President Duda of Poland on the fringes of CPAC getting an audience with Trump, although Trump made him wait in front of running television cameras for an hour. The foreign ministers of the three Baltic states had a meeting with Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, last week. That doesn't seem to have been a total catastrophe, although it's not really clear whether they got anywhere. And then this weekend, President Stubb of Finland had what appears to have been about as successful a meeting with Trump as it's possible to have. They played golf. It turns out that Stubb used to play for the Finnish national team and actually won a golfing scholarship to an American university. It turns out to be an incredibly important diplomatic skill in this day and age. You think about Shinzo Abe and how he got through to Trump on the golf course. But after that, you had Trump saying for the first time that he was, apologies for his language, pissed off at Putin for dragging his heels over the peace negotiations in Ukraine. Fine. That's all well and good, and it makes a lot of strategic sense, but I worry that it's an obstacle to thinking about, creatively, about the hard dilemmas that we're confronted with. And I really think Northern Europe, if it's anywhere, is precisely where the intellectual energy focusing on this problem should be. And I think this process should be happening not just behind closed doors, it should be happening out in the open, because this is something that is going to require public consent and an informed public. And I'd like to conclude with some remarks that Dwight Eisenhower made in 1951, when he was appointed as the first Supreme Allied Commander in Europe of NATO. And this was at a time when America's enthusiasm for NATO under the Truman administration had initially been anything but pronounced. Truman had eventually been kind of won around, had a hell of a time winning support for it in Congress, and then dispatched Eisenhower because of his just tremendous charisma and star power, because they felt nobody was actually really paying that much attention to NATO, which seems really odd from today's perspective, but at the time they really felt that they had a kind of publicity issue. And in Eisenhower's first speech, he stood there and said that the fact that he was there was an indictment of the current state of Europe, that Western Europe had a population of about 350 million people, enormous industrial capacity and a highly skilled workforce. And they just shouldn't be afraid of 190 million backward Soviets. And he said the only reason they was that there was disunity in the West, while the Soviets were united. And for that reason, he felt his job was to keep the United States in NATO for at least a decade. It didn't work out that way. And Eisenhower said, "Gentlemen, there's only one thing for us to do, and that is to get this combined spiral of strength going up. These people believe in the cause. Now they've got to believe in themselves." And the message must not entirely have cut through to some of the Europeans, because when he first met his counterparts in Paris, he lost his temper at what he regarded as their obtuseness and started banging on the podium after one country after another lined up to say they just didn't have the equipment or the personnel. And he shouted so loud that witnesses said he could have been heard 2 or 3 floors below him. He said he knew there were weaknesses and said, "I myself make up for part of that shortage. What I can do and what I can, I put into this. And the rest of it has to be made up by you people. Now get at it." And I think that is a very good principle for us to bear in mind at the moment.
Thank you so much, Oliver. That was great. We have quite a bit of time for a discussion, so let's unpack it, as they say. First, the region itself. You, as a true Brit, you consider the Baltic region to be not only the 3 little Baltic states, but the whole literal of the Baltic states, right? So including Scandinavia, but also Germany. Do you think do you think this works? Because to take the EU analogy, you know, Germany, some could claim that Germany is probably the Spain of the Baltic region. Well, you know, the Baltic states are still the Baltic states of the Baltic region. And so when we talk already about matters of war and peace, you know, can we really imagine this as some sort of unified area, either militarily or, you know, geopolitically? Because the problem that the Danes might have or the Germans might have, you know, are probably, these problems are probably very different from what the Baltic states might have, right? And the big question is whether these Spains of the Baltic region or Portugals, whether they would really like to commit to the defense of, let's say, the three little Baltic states or Poland.
It's a very good question. And I like the description of Germany as the Spain of the Baltic region. I don't think it's right, because what the German public has been through since February 2022 is an absolutely extraordinary shift of attitudes, and now public sentiment in Germany on all sorts of different security questions is completely all over the place. If a pollster asks the German voters, do you want peace with Russia and Ukraine now? A majority will say yes. If they say, do you want the German government to continue supplying weapons to Ukraine at the current level or to increase it? A majority will still say yes. If they say, do you believe Germany should be spending 3 or 3.5% of its GDP on defence? A majority will say yes. Which says to me that there is a very deep public recognition in Germany that they're not Spain, that they're in the firing line and they're scared, to the point where extraordinarily, and it's amazing this didn't get more attention, the Alternative for Germany party, the AfD, in its manifesto, committed to rearmament. And I sat down and asked one of their deputy parliamentary leader, okay, who is this against? Who are you afraid of? And she said, well, nobody really. It's just good to be strong. And I actually think that's a really common attitude in the German public, that it's a very kind of diffuse sense that there's something dangerous out there. It might be Russia, it might be something else, but it's good that we are rearming ourselves. In military terms, the Baltic Sea region is very clearly unified, and Germany is absolutely at the core of it, partly because it's the framework nation for naval defence of the Baltic, and it's established its new naval command for the Baltic region at Rostock. But mainly because if you think about the logistics of how you defend the Baltic states, you have your first line of defence where, you know, you've got the brigades, the NATO brigades and battalions, you've got the domestic armed forces, you've got whatever the Finns and the Poles can or will get there in a hurry. And then you need to start bringing in vast, vast quantities of personnel and kit. And how are they going to get there? Some of them might come across Scandinavia now that you've got Finland and Sweden as members of NATO. That's quite an important resupply route. But the most obvious thing is through German roads and railways. And therefore, Germany is logistically, it describes itself as the turntable of NATO in Europe. The really interesting question is whether Poland belongs in the Baltic Sea region. Because historically, as I alluded to in what I was banging on earlier, Poland has always tended to look to the west and to the east and the south. It hasn't had that much coastline for most of its history. And in fact, after the borders of Poland were shunted to the west by Stalin in 1945, they had so much coastline they didn't know what to do with it, because they didn't really have maritime traditions. A lot of the Polish words for things like rigging and wake had to be borrowed from other languages that had more developed nautical cultures. And under Polish governments since Solidarność happened and Poland deposed its communist regime, there has been an extremely strong focus on the land war to the east, primarily looking at Belarus, Kaliningrad, Suwałki Gap, and Ukraine. Nothing on the Navy. I mean, the Polish Navy is in an absolutely parlous state. And now that Donald Tusk has returned as Prime Minister at the end of 2023, there are some very promising signs that Poland is finally trying to become a paid-up member of this security club. I don't think it's on the point of joining the Joint Expeditionary Force, which would be kind of gold card membership of the club. I'm not even sure that the Jeff wants Poland in there, to be perfectly honest. But he's certainly put out a lot more feelers. There are now regular consultations between the Nordic and Baltic countries and Poland before EU summits. So I think Poland is getting there. So yeah, I totally take the direction of travel of your question, but I would say it is more coherent than it is not.
Interesting. Let's talk about this country now. In the beginning of your presentation, you told us how, in the beginning, I think, of the last century, the British were writing about the three little Baltic peoples, you know, the sort of supercilious treatment and sort of backward races which are doomed to sort of extinction vis-a-vis Russia. And today, you know, we have all this talk here about brotherhood with the Baltic states, and, you know, they're all for Ukraine, and these Balts, they come here and they get a pat on the back. But do you think that, as of now, Britain would really defend the Baltic, if we talk just about the little Baltic states, would they really defend the Baltic states, meaning sending their men to die, actually, for this faraway land? Because, you know, Britain had 1,000 years to perfect its nice diplomatic language, right? They're very good at it. The agreements, the security agreements that they sign with all these countries recently, they look very nice. They have names, you know, like a 100 or 1,000 years agreement with Ukraine, and they do similar stuff. You know, they give security guarantees to Finland before it joined NATO. But when you actually read these agreements, there's like nothing there. There's just no substance. So, and you know, when Starmer recently, when he did his meeting on Ukraine, he didn't even invite the Baltic states. And the Baltic states were very offended. You know, they imagined themselves as sort of spearhead of anti-Russian policy in the world, and the British didn't even care to invite them. So do you believe all that brotherhood sort of narrative, or has anything changed since the time you were talking about in the last century?
While we're on the subject of those very dismissive descriptions of the Baltic peoples in the 1920s, I have a lot of material on Lithuania that I decided not to cite out of consideration for your patriotic spirit. Would Britain send people to die for Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania? This is a question that was put in France very famously in 1939, I think by a satirical essayist first, but it often gets attributed to the Minister of Aviation. Mourir pour Danzig. Would you die? Why would we die for Danzig? And the ultimate conclusion was, well, we won't. We're not actually, when the chips are down, prepared to die for Danzig. And look what happened as a result of that. In the present, there is a kind of speciously easy answer to your question, which is that we don't have to send people to fight for the Baltic states, because we have 1,000 soldiers at Tapa in Estonia who are integrated into the Estonian military command system. And so in theory, the Estonians could tell them, right, you're off to Narva, come and help us repel this Russian incursion. In practice, I suspect London would like a veto over that. So your question, I think, I can't get around it that way. I think it really depends on who else is doing what and what kind of response we can coordinate. And what really worries me is that we might not get much warning if something does happen, and there won't be time to kind of ring around Paris and Warsaw and Berlin and Washington and say, what are you guys doing? Fancy giving me some political support if I put my men on the line in about 20 minutes' time? And I can't speak for what the British government would do in that scenario, but I could certainly see why there would be cause for hesitation. And I think this is precisely why I said what I said at the end of the presentation, that we need to have these discussions now, that particular one not in public, but more broadly about the really rapid structures for coordinating the kind of political response that would give Britain cover to act in that situation. And the same question will be posed of Germany, which has its brigade in Lithuania, and Canada, which leads the multinational brigade in Latvia. But I do think your question gets at the heart of something very profound and troubling about this situation we're in, which is that once you pull the certainty of America's security guarantees away, each country really is forced to think about what are my core national interests in extremis and what am I prepared to sacrifice for them. And I do really worry that if we don't use this moment of political momentum that we have as a result of the shock from Vance's speech, that the response to that just won't come, and that countries will increasingly start to weigh these things up and think, well, you know what, maybe I'm going to look after my own territorial security, but maybe I don't care that much about Estonia.
Well, your book is a very good argument why you should care, right? My last question before we give it to the audience, and this is a bigger one, so I'll play the devil's advocate now a little bit. So one of the messages of your book was essentially that the Russians are coming. They sort of want at least the three little Baltic states. You know, Putin thinks about them. We should spend, and we should have listened to the Baltic states, and we should listen about, you know, the Russians basically coming for us. Now, a critic might say that actually this is quite an exaggeration of the Russian threat for the Baltic states specifically. And that would be for 5 reasons. So the first one, a critic might say that actually this whole narrative that the Russians are coming for us is inspired, of course, by the Ukrainians, because Ukraine is fighting this war alone. It doesn't have any allies, and it's interested in sort of spreading this war outside Ukraine because that would reduce pressure on Ukraine, and it's a very natural thing to desire if you are a Ukrainian. The second argument against that is that, you know, if you say that the Russians are coming for the Baltic states, then you have to explain 35 years of Russia's disinterest in the Baltic states, whether they were in NATO, when they were without NATO, because in the last 35 years, Russia sort of observed the policy of non-interference in internal affairs of the Baltic states. So there has been no Russian money in Baltic politics to speak of, no political assassinations, no little Donbasses anywhere. Even on sensitive questions like Russian minorities in Latvia and Estonia, the Russians didn't really do anything to really squeeze the Baltic states, which they could have done quite easily. The thing that they did, they only resorted to sort of naming and shaming in international organizations or just voicing their dissatisfaction. And, you know, Russia's policy in the Baltics, one a critic might say, has been nothing like it was in places like Montenegro, you know, another NATO state, by the way. But Russia's treatment of Montenegro is completely different. There they plan to assassinate the prime minister. They're pouring money into their politics all the time, and because, of course, Serbs, and it's a very different context. Or, you know, even more if we talk the Black Sea region, Georgia and Ukraine and all that. The third argument against that is that one might say that those who say that the Russians are coming actually are usually those who know nothing about Russia. They can't even speak Russia, they haven't been to Russia, they don't know anyone in today's Russian politics. They can't call anyone to figure things out. And a sort of blind reductionism, if you will, which disregards Russian leaders' motivations themselves. You know, the idea that Putin wakes up and the first thing he does every morning thinks about how, you know, to conquer the Baltic states. Some critics might find that ridiculous. And Baltic states themselves, you know, these days they don't know much about Russia. Actually, we came to the situation, and this is true, that this country, for instance, knows about Russia more than the Baltic states who live next to Russia, because they have no diplomatic representation in Russia anymore. Less and less diplomats are able to speak Russian. They don't know who to call if things go south in Moscow. So, and before that, they used to, you know, pride themselves for being this sort of link and, you know, experts of Russia. Now it's not the case anymore. Even the Americans know more about Russia. And then the fourth line of argument, and I'll finish soon, is that they, if the Baltic states actually really feared Russia, they would be acting very differently. And today they're supplying lethal weaponry to Ukraine, left, right, and center. And you know, they wouldn't do that if they really feared Russia. And not only that, you know, Lithuania, for instance, tried to blockade Kaliningrad just because, you know, they could. And finally, the last argument that a critic might pose would be that, you know, we shouldn't pretend that we don't know why the West and Russia fell out over Ukraine and Georgia. You know, it's this geopolitics, Black Sea region, Crimea, and so on. And comparing, you know, saying that, you know, because Russia invaded Ukraine, it's going to invade the Baltic states, is just a non sequitur because, you know, it's apples and potatoes comparison. Ukraine is a totally different world than the Baltic states, which Russia actually let go peacefully to NATO without firing a single shot. So what would be your answer to these criticisms?
Well, the very simple answer is that it does not say in the book that the Russians are coming.
It kind of implies that.
It really doesn't, because I am one of these people who don't know about Russia. I can't speak Russian. I've only ever been to Russia once. I read everything I could. I spoke to as many people who seemed to have useful insight as I could. I laid out the arguments for why Putin might want to attack one of the Baltic states or all of them, and also the arguments against that. And I sat on the fence, much to my own dissatisfaction, because I felt, frankly, it's not my area of expertise. I'm not sure one way or the other, and here's the material that readers can use to make up their own minds. And the one thing that is in our power here is deterrence. If there is an equation going on in the Kremlin about this, to make sure that that equation is, at least in Putin's perception, so stacked against Russia, that the cost-benefit analysis falls so heavily into cost that it just doesn't look like a viable prospect. But I do think your arguments are worth taking really seriously. So I'll talk about them all the same. So the first one, if I understood you correctly, is that the Ukrainians have been spreading this idea that the Baltics are next, which they totally have. But also, this idea was around before 2014. And it really took off in sort of 2015, 2016, when you had all these kind of doom-laden scenarios of a Russian-speaking uprising in southeastern Latvia, and then the tanks roll in, or Narva's the one that keeps coming up. There's an incredible novel by Sir Richard Shirreff, who's the former head of the British Armed Forces, where he absolutely terrible prose, but he really kind of plays through all this and the kind of sinking of the British aircraft carrier and so on. But I think just the fact that Ukraine is saying you should be worried because you might be next doesn't mean people are not organically worried in their own right about it. This thing about why didn't Russia, the second counter-argument. Why didn't Russia act when it had 35 years to do so? I think the answer is, if you want to assume Russia does have some kind of long-term aggressive intent towards the Baltic states, is that they joined NATO in 2004. Before that, Russia wasn't really in a very kind of invading mood. It was tied up in the Chechen wars, which it only got out of in 2002, I think. And it was only really with the invasion of Georgia 4 years after that it started waging wars on foreign terrain. And in terms of its broader policy towards the Baltics, you characterised it as being very restrained. I'm not sure that's how I see it. I mean, if you go back as far as 2007 with the infamous Night of Bronze in Estonia, where this Red Army War Memorial was moved from one very prominent war cemetery to a slightly less prominent war cemetery. And there was just this kind of rioting spread by agents provocateurs, but also enthusiastically participated in by Putin sympathising Russian speakers in Estonia, and this absolute deluge of cyber attacks, which is really the ground zero for modern NATO cyber defence strategy. And if you look at, going back to the Karaganov doctrine of the 1990s and how the so-called compatriots, the Russian speakers, not just in the Baltic states, but also in Ukraine, have been kind of treated as a kind of potential tool, an instrument of foreign policy, and the way that the Russian security services have used people like Tatiana Ždanoka, one of the most prominent politicians on the kind of Russian-speaking end of Latvia's political spectrum. And the most recent example that really stuck in my head was Russia issuing an arrest warrant for Kaja Kallas when she was Estonia's Prime Minister, and for about 65 other politicians in the Baltic states, and Maria Zaryakova, how do you pronounce it again? Zakharova, sorry. The kind of mouthpiece of the Russian Foreign Ministry, arguing that they've made themselves Nazis with their memory politics towards Soviet war memorials on their territory, which is the same language that Russia has used about Zelensky's government and the political establishment in Ukraine. Number three, if people who say that don't really know anything about Russia, I'm one of these people. I put my hand up. I've done my best in the book, but I'm not a Russia specialist, and I think that's fine. And you argue that the Baltic states don't really have the level of Russia expertise. There may be a fair amount of truth in that. I think the Finns do have a lot of Russia expertise. I mean, for a very long time, really up until 2022, they saw themselves as being the kind of the bridge between Europe and Russia, and people like presidents like Tarja Halonen and Sauli Niinisto really played a role where they kind of had Putin's attention and his respect, if not his ear. And so I think I would trust Finland's threat perception, and when Finland has closed its border and joined NATO, I would say, listen to them, because they have a pretty good idea of how this goes. Number four, if the Baltic states really feared Russia, why are they giving so much of their weaponry to Ukraine? There are two things to say there. The first is that in their calculus, the Ukrainians are doing the fighting and dying for them, and that this is actually the cheapest way of keeping Russia off their backs. But there's also a kind of interesting psychological point about fear, I think, which is that in Britain we often mischaracterise the psychological state of Baltic politics and how they talk about this. I don't think I've ever met anyone I would say was afraid. It's more that, you know, if you're in Estonia, you're living next to an active volcano that goes off once every sort of few decades. I never actually fact-checked this, but I often hear from Estonians that they've been invaded 40 times by various incarnations of the Russian state. And then finally, the domino effect, this argument that actually it's a load of rubbish, and that if you're comparing Putin's designs on Ukraine to Putin's attitude towards the Baltic states, they're apples and potatoes. I think that's actually a really good argument. It's one of the big things that gave me pause for thought on this whole "the Russians are coming" narrative, because, again, if you'll excuse my language, the Baltic states were a pain in the arse under Soviet occupation, and absorbing them today with their extremely strongly developed sense of national identity would potentially trigger all kinds of other disintegrative forces across the rest of the Russian Federation. And it could be like a massive strategic mistake just from the perspective of Russia's own integrity.
Thank you very much. Great discussion. Now let's have some audience input. Who'd like to start? Yes, gentleman over there. Boris.
Thank you. You mentioned that Trump would like to reshape Europe in his own image. Trump and his men. The same probably with Putin, who would like to do the same. But what about Europe itself? Does it know exactly what kind of shape it wants to take or to keep? I'm asking about this kind of value consensus, because you quoted Eisenhower, but that was quite many years ago. Does this kind of value consensus still exist at all? Does Europe know what kind of shape it wants to take? Now when liberalism was declared as good as dead.
It's a fantastic question, to which I probably don't have a thoroughly compelling answer. I guess the point of departure would be, what is Europe? Is Europe Hungary? Is Europe Slovakia? Yes, Slovakia. Is Europe the Czech Republic if Babiš comes back in at the election this year? Who gets to decide what Europe's collective identity is? I mean, national identity and values are hard enough to define. We've had this debate in the UK for decades without reaching any meaningful conclusion. The Germans are going through the same process now, and doing it on a European scale, I think, is extremely difficult. And then the other thing about common values is, what do you do when your values do not coincide with your interests? And one very difficult thing about this moment for the kind of liberal democratically minded governments has been the realization that values-led foreign policy is all very well, but this is a point in time where we really have to start developing a much clearer and more cynical, in some ways, understanding of our own interests. So where does that leave us in terms of whether we're willing to fashion Europe in its own image? I think you can take a very minimalist view of this. And this is something I argue in the chapter about Latvia in the book, that we have just got too hung up on a very maximal definition of what liberal democracy is and all of the duties and responsibilities that come with that. And we could just be more pluralistic about it. And the Baltic states are actually a really, really good case study here, because they didn't have democracy for 50 years. They didn't have the right to vote. They didn't have the right to free expression. So if you look at the kind of things about the European model that they are most keen to cling to, they are probably the bits of the European model that we should be trying to cleave to now.
Other questions? Yes, Kasper.
You mentioned at the start of your talk, where you alluded to this idea of urgency in the Baltic psyche, I suppose, in a way. And I suppose you could make the argument that this was really, the necessity of this urgency was really hit home to them in quite a visceral way through Soviet occupation. And my question is, how can Western European states, where you say they perhaps need to adopt a similar sense of urgency, how can they do that in the absence of such an historical force? How can policymakers do that? How can this take place?
Another very good question. And it's really very difficult. And especially in Britain, I've been quite personally disappointed by the failure of successive governments since 2022 to explain how much skin in the game we really have in terms of a NATO-Russia conflict, and the fact that we are not doing what we're doing in Ukraine, and we don't have a battalion in Estonia out of goodwill or charity, but because if there is a war, we're going to be in trouble as well. And I think being clearer with the public about what is at stake here is a really good place to start. And weirdly, sorry, just to add, that doesn't necessarily mean frightening people. You're not trying to cause panic or alarm. You can look at Finland and the way that their leaders talk to the public for a really brilliant model of calm, let's hope for the best but prepare for the worst, and the best way to prevent the worst is to prepare for it kind of attitude that I think is pretty transferable to Britain's politics. And the country that really gives me hope in this context, weirdly, is Germany, where Friedrich Merz, the probable incoming chancellor, has just pulled off one of the most spectacular political manoeuvres in my lifetime in order to exempt defence spending from the constitutional lock on government borrowing. They had to rewrite the constitution. For that, you need a 2/3 majority in the Bundestag, and it was very clear that the newly voted Bundestag would have more than a third of its MPs from the radical left and the radical right, both of which would have reasons to obstruct that process. And he resorted to this extremely cynical, tactical manoeuvre of keeping the old Bundestag on life support after the election in order to get the MPs to vote for it literally on the last day they could possibly have done it. And the amazing thing is that while the polls show a majority of the voters think it was electoral fraud and despise the tactics that he used, they love the policy. It's overwhelmingly popular. And in this country that has traditionally had a proverbial anxiety about both private and public debt, for borrowing something like 20 or 25 percentage points of your GDP in literally one stroke of a pen, or at least opening up that fiscal space, is just absolutely extraordinary. And I think there the sense of concern, in very large part fostered by Trump and J.D. Vance, has had that effect of creating a kind of politics of existential urgency like those that Lennart Meri worked with in Estonia.
Charles.
Great talk. Two questions. One, going back to Eisenhower's point. In the event that America did withdraw and Europe did want to take on the responsibilities, you described all the dependencies that exist in the NATO system and so on. How quickly do you think it would be possible for Europe to get to a position of being able to make the European defence network stand up without full-scale American participation? We've talked about this on a number of our events. I get all kinds of different answers from different people, military people and so on. Obviously it depends on events, but I'd be interested in your conversation. And my second question is completely different. I thought this was a great book, but I also took out of the future of Europe not only the security issues which we've been exclusively discussing now, but also the Baltics' economic status as the future of Europe, particularly in terms of technology and so on. Could you just say a word about that as well, please?
Yes, on the dependencies, having outed myself as a complete non-expert on Russia, I also have to say I'm not a military guy. And the other speakers you will have had at the centre who've been asked this question will have been far more qualified than I am. I've spoken to a lot of serving and retired people from various European militaries and analysts, and obviously I kind of keep up with the think tank and academic literature on it. But please caveat everything I'm about to say with the fact that I'm not kind of deeply versed in this. Where are the dependencies? The intelligence dependency in terms of the extent of Europe's human intelligence networks, its signals intelligence capacity, and above all, its reconnaissance capacity with spy satellites and so on, is very severe. And it's not clear to me that we've yet reached a point, for example, where the OneWeb satellite initiative, well, that's for communications, of course, but it feeds into the same complex of dependence on American soft technology with military applications, that's going to be anywhere near a rival to Starlink within the next decade. Again, not being an intelligence expert, I really struggle to know how quickly we could replace that 80%, or if we could even replace it at all in terms of the intelligence reports that go through NATO HQ. On things like logistics and missile defence, which are the really obvious gaps that the Americans would leave behind, those are reparable. We just need to. It's just that's an industrial question basically, and we have a very good missile maker in MDBA, the sort of Franco-German conglomerate that can do air defence systems of various ranges, and if you combine that with the things that you can buy from Israel and even our existing Patriots, you can start to build up a more kind of credible battery. The one I really struggle with is nuclear deterrence, because Trident, my understanding is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because you probably know more about this than I do, but there's only ever one submarine at sea at a time. And therefore, in theory, if you, in the worst case scenario, do have to launch, you are exposing your entire at-sea deterrent to retaliatory strike, right? And the French have both submarine and air-launched warheads, but again, please correct me if I've got this wrong, but I believe they've got no kind of low-yield warheads, so they really have a hard time calibrating the nuclear response if, for example, the Putin regime were to fire a low-yield nuclear warhead and explode it over the sea itself, because they've only got kind of city-killing nuclear bombs. And of course, the French nuclear deterrent is in a purely national command structure since the days of de Gaulle. And for that reason, I really welcome the debate, not just about Germany doing some kind of nuclear sharing arrangement with France or Britain, but even I think we're going to have to start thinking about nuclear proliferation. Not necessarily, I'm not necessarily endorsing nuclear proliferation within Europe here, but I've had people in various governments confidently predict to me in the past week that they expect South Korea to go nuclear in fairly short order, and that Saudi Arabia might follow. And once the brakes are off, they're off. And Poland and Germany definitely look like candidates. I mean, in Germany, the politics are currently extremely against it, but the technical base is there, and you could certainly see the case for. I mean, I really hope that we don't get driven to this, because it would be a profoundly unstable, or even more unstable situation. And on your excellent point about the future of Europe being far broader than just kind of security thinking and the economic status. I mean, it's just amazing what has happened. I was looking up the numbers today, and in purchasing power parity terms, Poland's GDP per capita is about to overtake Japan's. Estonia's already has. Lithuania, which is on rocket boosters. Is it still?
It's more than Estonia.
But it's catching up, right? Because Estonia stagnated a bit over the
So
past.
it's more than any other Baltic states out of the three.
Yeah. So Lithuania is going absolutely gangbusters. I did look into whether there are kind of economic lessons we can learn from this. I basically concluded, in the kind of grand macroeconomic sense, there aren't really, because a lot of this is kind of a catch-up effect and moving up the value chain. But the tech sector, which you mentioned, especially but not only in Estonia, is a tremendous case study. In fact, not to undermine my own book, but there's a very good new book about it by an American who was involved in Estonia's digital government system, called Joel Burke. It's called Rebooting the Nation, that tells the story of this in a lot more detail than I do. And there, I guess, it's the way that their construction of an entire industry, basically from scratch, interacted with the existential urgency and the need to really focus on, look at my resources, what have I got, how do I deploy them to best effect? And I don't know if that's really feasible for a kind of mature industrial economy like Britain or Germany, but it's a very interesting way of thinking about the state's involvement in economic development.
Brendan.
Thank you very much. Great talk and great book. And I just want to say that there's only 5 copies left for those of you who want one. And make sure you rush to the table. Oh, there are? Ah, right. Yeah. Anyway, my question is, I mean, you mentioned quite a bit the uncertainty coming out of Washington. So if the pessimistic view of that, from our point of view, eventuates, where do the states of the Baltic Sea regions look? Do they look to Poland? Do they look to Germany? What would be their plan B?
The conversations I've had with officials from the region in the past few weeks since the Munich Security Conference lead me to believe that the body that they see as being most relevant in terms of security guarantees, if the American ones are withdrawn, is the Joint Expeditionary Force, which means Britain. But they're also very sceptical about Britain's leadership and about its military capacity. Riho Terras, the former head of the Estonian armed forces, was actually on Times Radio yesterday saying that he didn't believe that Britain would be able to send a brigade out to Estonia for an impending NATO exercise. And publicly they insist that they're happy that Britain has chosen, unlike the Germans in Lithuania and unlike the Canadians in Latvia, only to keep a battalion-sized deployment in the NATO forward presence. So that's 1,000 soldiers as opposed to, well, anything from 3,000 to 5,000 in a brigade, like the other 2 Baltic states have got. That they recognise the kind of resource constraints, but they're also just profoundly unhappy about it. And so I think they have to look not just to Britain, but to a kind of combination of countries for their security guarantees. And the most obvious candidates would basically be the so-called Group of 5, or the Weimar Plus countries. And this comes back to your question earlier about the Baltic states not being in the room for that first summit that Keir Starmer hosted after the Munich Security Conference, which was really organised around the core of the Weimar Plus countries, because the initial perception was this is the one forum of, so just to be clear, that's the UK, France, Germany, Italy and Poland, of really militarily capable countries in Europe that are actually in a position to make serious decisions about this stuff. So I can only assume or speculate that it would be some sort of fusion in an ideal world of the Weimar Plus and the JEF, but whether that's satisfying or not is another question. The other elephant in the room, maybe not in terms of hard security guarantees, but something we haven't talked about at all today, is China, where we're still very much waiting to see how the Chinese government decides to exploit this sense of alienation in Europe and what kind of offer they might be prepared to make. So far, I mean, again, I keep listing things I'm not an expert on, and China is another of them. As far as I know, they haven't yet really shown much sign of wanting to hold out a carrot to America's stick at this point. There's been some nice language, including from Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister in Munich, literally speaking immediately after Vance. But that's going to open up a whole different can of worms, especially because while Lithuania has been very assertive against China under its previous government, China does also have quite a deep economic relationship with many of the countries. It owns stakes in the ports at Gdynia in Poland, Stockholm in Sweden. It sends a lot of freight traffic through the Baltic ports. So, yeah, they're in a... I don't think they would turn to China for security guarantees, but it will be another coordinate on this map that they're looking at.
Thank you. Yes.
And my question is from a slightly different angle, from your experience and interviews. What are your views on integration of the Russian minority population in the Baltics, especially Latvia?
I'm really glad you asked that, because there's a whole chapter on the Latvian Russian-speaking minority in the book. And there are basically two caricatures of the situation that we have in Western Europe, and they go hand in hand. And one of them is that the Russian speakers are basically kind of fifth columnists, just waiting for the call from Moscow to rise up against their oppressors. And then the other caricature is that the kind of Latvian state is really oppressing them. And the Latvian state in particular has taken a pretty tough line on the use of Russian language in public institutions and in schools, and on the presence of Soviet war memorials, including most famously the Victory column on the left bank of the Daugava in Riga. And I would argue that it has used the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine and the horror about it as a point at which it can kind of complete this process of nation building and kind of redefine the rights and the role of the Russian speakers in Latvia. And honestly, I struggle to see what other viable strategy the Latvian government would have had under the circumstances, given that something like 33% of the population is still Russian speaking. But it's a very, very complicated and uncomfortable subject to write about. I think because it bumps up against a junction of different strands of liberal thought, where on the one hand you have kind of the decolonisation and the kind of idea of rebuilding national identity after a period of foreign occupation and exploitation. But on the other hand, you have the idea of the protection of minority rights. Sorry, I'm really kind of going around in circles on this because I think it is such a delicate topic. But one thing I would say is that as far as we can tell, the politics of the Russian-speaking minority in Latvia are totally fragmented. And we saw this with the last parliamentary election, where the two main parties that they would traditionally have turned to for representation, Harmony or Saskana, and God, my mind's going blank for a moment. Is it the LNKS?
What's that?
The kind of slightly more Kremlin curious of the parties that represent the Russian represented the Russian speakers in Latvia. It's the Latvian Russian Union, LKS? LKS, yeah. Where they were basically wiped out and replaced with a kind of slightly weird postmodern populist startup called For Stability. And I really did not get the sense that beyond a few diehards and people who have been pro-Moscow right from the Interfront movement at the end of the 1980s, that there is actually that much active support for the Putin regime left in the Russian-speaking minority, and that while a lot of people are very sad and upset at their position in the country, I don't see that translating into a kind of anything like a fifth column.
Would you agree that if Russia decides to escalate on the pretext of Russian minorities, it will not actually be about the minorities as such? Because if you look what how Russia deals with its minorities issues in Central Asia, they don't really care. Putin doesn't really care about rights of Russia in Central Asia because geopolitics and so on. So, would you say in the Baltic it's also the case that that could never be a sort of a real reason for Russia's escalation in the Baltic minority?
I've done a lot of reading on the so-called compatriots policy and how it gets applied across the former states of the Soviet Union, and I still struggle to read the extent to which there might be some sense of genuine emotional collectiveness behind it. I suspect there probably isn't very much. But one thing I think you can say is that if there were to be an attempt to foment an organic uprising, even in Ida-Viru County, the northeast of Estonia, around Narva, from everything that I've heard and read, they would really struggle to get a fire going, no matter how many sparks they put there. And the only purpose that the Russian-speaking communities serve Russia strategically in that scenario is as a casus belli.
Thank you so much, Oliver. That was great discussion, great book. I'm afraid this is all we have time for today. Quite even-handed, by the way, for a Baltic book. It's really good. Lots of research is in there. Just get it at the back of the room there. There is also wine that's waiting for you. Don't run away. And let's give a big round of applause.